One weekend last summer, a group of girlfriends and I rented an Airbnb for the weekend to celebrate a friend's birthday. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. We found a cozy Airbnb in a secluded part of the mountains. A perfect place in a beautiful area with no neighbors, so we didn't have to worry about making too much noise while partying. The pictures showed a charming cabin with a fireplace and a wraparound porch surrounded by towering pines. The reviews were mostly positive, except for a few mentions of the host being overly attentive and welcoming. At the time, we shrugged it off, thinking it was more of a good thing than a problem. We arrived on Friday evening, excited and ready to unwind. The host, a middle-aged man named Harold, greeted us warmly. He informed us that we would have the house all to ourselves as he stayed in a smaller guest cabin on the property. As we settled in that first night, everything was fine. We cooked dinner, played games, and just had a good time celebrating the birthday weekend. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get weird. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock on the door. We weren't expecting anyone, and it made us all jump. I opened the door to find Harold standing there, holding a small basket of snacks. He had just wanted to check in on us, seeing if we had any problems with the place, and offered the snacks, which we politely declined. It was strange for him to have visited that late at night, but it was whatever. It was only about an hour later that night, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I noticed a shadow pass by the window outside on the wraparound porch. We went outside cautiously to check the porch, but saw nothing. A little while later, one of my friends said they swore they saw a figure standing outside the same window and looking into the house. By the time we checked it out again, however, there was nobody there. Later that night, around midnight, we were in the living room, trying to shake off the things that we thought we saw and still have a good time. Then, Harold knocked again, this time without any snacks. This time he asked if everybody was okay, saying that he heard some noises. It felt very intrusive, but we began questioning if he had also seen whoever that was earlier moving around the property. We assured him we were fine, and he left to go back to his cabin. The next morning, we decided to check out the surrounding area and do a little exploration. As we were getting ready for the hike, I noticed a strange glint in the sunlight coming from the corner of the room. I walked over and discovered a small camera hidden behind a decorative object. I showed my friends the hidden camera, and we began to search the rest of the place. We found more cameras, one in the living room, another in the bathroom, and yet another hidden in the bedroom. They were all well concealed, but once you knew where to look, they were almost laughably obvious. We quickly put together that the figure we had seen on the porch by the window was probably our host Harold watching us last night, since he also had the cameras set up. We decided to ditch our morning hike and leave immediately before our checkout time. We didn't want to confront Harold because we were creeped out and just wanted to get away from there. We left the keys on the kitchen counter, grabbed our bags, and drove off without notifying Harold. Once we got back into cell service, I quickly opened the Airbnb app and left a review. I warned future guests about the hidden cameras and the creepy visits from the host. It felt important to make sure nobody else would experience what we did. The next day, I reported everything to Airbnb and hoped that Harold would be done hosting forever. The house my husband and I have lived in for a while now has an Airbnb next door as neighbors. It has been operating for close to a year now as an Airbnb. My husband and I often noticed the guests coming and going. Most of them would stay to themselves, and a few would talk to us, but they were all nice people. However, one night in late September, we encountered some creepy guests who were staying at the Airbnb. It was a warm evening, and we were settling down to watch a movie when I noticed movement outside. I glanced out the window and saw a younger-looking couple in the Airbnb's backyard. They seemed to be setting up something odd with candles and laying other things down on the ground. I showed my husband, and we both agreed that it was strange. Our best guess was they were setting up some sort of ritual. However weird it was, everyone has their own unique hobbies, and who were we to judge what they wanted to do with their time at the Airbnb? We watched them for a while, unable to tear our eyes away. Firstly, it was just fun to watch, but also, we wanted to make sure that nothing extremely creepy was going on. They took a while to set up, so eventually we got bored and went back to watching our movie. Before going to bed, I checked out the window to see if the young couple was still out there. They still appeared to be just hanging out with whatever stuff they had set up, so I dismissed it and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I was gradually awoken by sounds coming through our bedroom window that was open for air. I could hear soft murmurs outside, low and rhythmic. I glanced at the clock, which showed that it was past 2 a.m. now. I woke up my husband, and we went to check out why the neighbors were still up at this time. We got out of bed and made our way to the back of the house and looked out the back window towards the backyards. Surprisingly, this time the young couple was in our backyard, standing and making strange movements in the flickering candlelight. It appeared they were doing whatever ritual thing they had set up earlier. What was even stranger was there were some lights in the woods, which were way out on the property away from our house. I guess the couple had set up some candles way out in the woods as well, but I wasn't sure. It didn't make sense. Somehow, it felt scarier to go outside and confront the couple about being on our property, rather than just let them continue what they were doing. We double-checked the house, locking all our doors and windows just in case before going back to bed. The next morning when we woke up, we cautiously walked into our backyard, checking to see if anything was damaged. It looked like the couple from the Airbnb had already left, since their car was gone. Everything was normal in our backyard, thankfully, besides a note that we found in the middle of the lawn pinned down by a rock. I bent down and picked up the small piece of paper and unfolded it to read it. It read, "Thank you for your participation. You have been blessed. Nothing major happened to us in our yard that night, but it was just really creepy in general. We left a message with the owner of the Airbnb, recommending not to let that young couple stay in again in the future if they tried to." A few years ago, I stayed at an Airbnb for the first and last time in my life. A small group of friends and I were on vacation, and we found an Airbnb for cheap, which still looked nice. It was nice because we didn't need to have any interaction with the host, since it was just a lockbox on the door with the key. The host had texted us the combination to get the key from the box, and we were able to let ourselves inside. Once inside, we got settled in and started making dinner. The house was pretty nice, just like we thought. What was strange though, as we explored the rooms, we noticed there were a lot of valuables just sitting out. For example, one of the rooms had a PS4 plugged in, and in a drawer in another room, there was some car and house insurance things, as well as some cash in a wallet. We thought it was strange how trusting the host was of random people staying in his place not to steal anything. We weren't planning on taking anything, but I'm sure there's some people who wouldn't think twice about it. Anyways, later that night after eating, we checked out the rest of the place, picked our bedrooms upstairs, and eventually checked out the basement. As we explored the large basement, we came across a door that was locked. The door being locked itself wasn't anything strange, but the fact that many valuables were left laying around in the house made us think, if none of the valuables were behind the locked door, what would the door need to be locked for, and what was behind it? Anyway, we continued with the rest of the night and went to bed at a good time since we had to be up early the next day. In the middle of that night, while sleeping in my bedroom upstairs, I was woken up with the urge to pee. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was bad enough to keep me up and I had to go to the bathroom. As I got out of bed and approached the door, I heard some movement out in the hallway. It sounded like somebody was shuffling down the carpeted hallway. I opened up my door to continue towards the bathroom, expecting to see one of my friends awake also trying to use the bathroom. When I opened my door, however, I saw someone at the end of the hallway opening a different door and look inside. I immediately could tell that this was not one of my friends based on the shape of the figure. I flipped on the light switch for the entire upper hallway, which was thankfully right near me. I screamed loud enough to wake up all my other friends as I saw a man at the end turn towards me with a look of surprise on his face. I was worried that he was going to attack someone, but thankfully, he seemed more ashamed and upset at getting caught snooping around the house and looking into our rooms. Turns out, he was the host of the Airbnb we were staying at. He tried to explain what he was doing here in the middle of the night, saying he was looking for some tools that he had left behind and needed for the morning. It wasn't a very convincing argument. After more questioning of the guy, we also found out he had been living in the locked room in the basement the whole time we had been there, even though he said we had the whole place to ourselves. Needless to say, all my friends and I are very certain that this guy was a creep and had probably been doing this to guests for years. On the bright side, at least he wasn't violent or aggressive, because we realized how much worse the situation at night could have been. I'm not certain what legal consequences this guy was faced with, but he did lose his right to rent out places at least. My partner and I had rented an Airbnb recently and stayed the weekend. We were in an area with less light pollution, and it was a clear night outside, so the first night we were there, we decided to stargaze. We sat outside in the backyard for most of the night with a glass of wine, looking up at the stars and talking. Since we got there, we had seen the neighbors out and about. To our left lived an older couple who seemed to always have their lights on, and to our right was a man who we hadn't met yet, but saw him walking out to his car from afar once. At some point during the night, I turned my head to glance at the neighbor on the right. There he was, pressed up against the broken fence that separated our yards. His face was illuminated by the light from his cell phone, which he was pointing in our direction. He appeared to be filming us. I felt exposed, like we were on display. My partner and I both just stared at him. He didn't seem to care that we'd caught him. He kept recording, oblivious or uncaring about the discomfort he was causing us. We had been outside that evening for a while now and weren't too upset about wrapping up and heading inside due to the weird neighbor. We tried to make light of the situation, joking how maybe he was just a big fan of astronomy or something. After hanging out in the living room for a while longer, we went to bed eventually. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of soft rustling. I glanced at my partner, who was sound asleep. I quietly got out of bed and walked to the window. I pulled the curtain aside just a fraction, enough to see into the yard. The same neighbor was standing outside, this time closer to our house. He was looking towards our windows. We had turned all the lights off before going to bed, so our Airbnb was completely dark. I decided to head out into the living room and kitchen area and turn on some small lights in those rooms. I was about ready to call the cops, but maybe because I had turned the lights on, when I looked back outside, the neighbor was back in his own yard. I watched him from a dark window where I wouldn't be seen. He seemed to stare over and scan our house a couple of times before heading back inside to his own house. I went back to bed, but left small lights on just in case he decided to come back around. The next night, when we got back to the Airbnb after our day out, we did not go outside. Mostly, we were just very tired from the day, but also didn't want to have any encounters with the creepy neighbor again. That night, my partner and I heard footsteps outside again, even though I had left small lights on in the house. Peeking outside through the curtain in the bedroom window, we were able to confirm that the neighbor was in the yard again. This time, he came closer to the house and began looking through the living room and kitchen windows. We notified the cops this time, but by the time they arrived, he had already made his way back to his own house. Thankfully, the next day we were planning on leaving. As we packed our things, we had a conversation over the phone with the host about the neighbor. We left right after on our way back home out of the state. Hopefully, the creepy neighbor was handled with and isn't terrorizing any future guests at that Airbnb. My family and I decided to spend a weekend at an Airbnb in a small town. The first night we settled in and watched TV for a while. My kids, who were 6 and 7 years old, were excited about exploring the backyard the next day. Around midnight, I heard a noise that pulled me from sleep. It sounded like whispers, faint and indistinct. I dismissed it as the wind or perhaps a neighbor talking, because after all, we were in a new place. The next morning, we woke up late. The kids had already found a treehouse in the backyard and a swing set. I joined them, and while they played, noticed that the treehouse and swing had seen better days. That evening, after dinner, we decided to play board games in the living room. The atmosphere was relaxed until I noticed the front door slightly open. I could have sworn I locked it. I locked it again and shrugged it off, thinking that I might have forgotten. As we played, the lights flickered a few times. My wife joked about it being a haunted house. I laughed it off, but I was starting to feel a little uneasy. The next day, we planned to explore the local sites. While driving around, we met a local at a coffee shop. I casually mentioned our Airbnb. The local's expression changed, and he asked if we had experienced anything strange. I laughed nervously and said not really, just some weird noises. He warned us that the house had a history, something about a family that had lived there and vanished without a trace. I brushed it off as local folklore, but I couldn't help but think of what we had been experiencing was a haunted Airbnb. Later that evening, my son had run inside to me crying. He said he had seen someone in the window of the treehouse and another person sitting on the swing while playing outside. After confirming that nobody was outside, I tried to comfort him, attributing it to an overactive imagination. But as night fell, I couldn't help but feel uneasy about the whole Airbnb as a whole. We decided to watch a movie to distract ourselves. Halfway through, the TV turned off. I got up to check the remote, but it was nowhere to be found. I searched the living room, and as I did, I felt a chill. I turned to see a shadow move across the wall. I froze for a moment, but convinced myself it was just my eyes playing tricks. I didn't want to scare the kids, so we just continued the night like everything was normal. Later that night, I woke up again, drawn by a soft sound. This time, it sounded like footsteps in the hallway. I felt compelled to investigate, and quietly walked down the hallway. When I reached the living room, I saw the door wide open again. There was enough weird stuff happening now to make me want to get out of there. The next morning, I told my wife about everything that I had experienced. She looked pale and said that she had felt some weird stuff too. We decided to cut the trip short a day, not because we were creeped out, but because we didn't want our kids to see something else and get freaked out. We left the house, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with that Airbnb.